All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So our objective for today is that students will be able to determine the growth factor and the initial value of an exponential relationship by looking at a graph. So that's all we're going to focus on today, is looking at a graph and figuring out how we find the growth factor and how we found the initial value or the starting value. Just remember, vocabulary-wise, the growth factor, that's the number that we're multiplying. And the initial value, that's also the starting value, or it's the value that we get at time 0. Very important when you're talking about exponential relationships. It's kind of like your initial population. So we're talking about populations for today. The scenario is that garter snakes were introduced to a new area 4 years ago. The population is growing exponentially, which we know means that it's multiplying. The relationship between the number of snakes and the year is modeled with an exponential function, right? Just function is another word for like an equation, right? So this is actually kind of like a real world scenario, right? Snakes, they can grow very fast because they're good predators, especially if they're in an area where there typically aren't snakes. So if you click on this link right here, that's going to take you to a YouTube video. It's about 4 minutes long, and it shows you just kind of an example of snakes that are let loose into the wild by accident, and they start kind of wreaking havoc and just growing exponentially. So if you want to watch that video, feel free to pause this, take a look at that video now. Okay, now what we're doing today is, again, like I said, we're looking at a graph and trying to figure out some information from it, right? Two things we're trying to figure out are the initial value and the growth factor, and we can find that by looking at the graph. But what we're going to do to help us find that is we're actually going to make a table of values, because it's a lot easier to see it from the table than looking at the graph. So we're going to use this graph to fill out this table, okay? Now, before we get started, just some stuff that's good to know is it's helpful to understand when looking at any information, what are the variables involved? And specifically, which one is your dependent variable, which one is your independent variable. So your dependent variable is always going to come from your y-axis. That's the one that goes up and down. It's on the left-hand side of the graph. So in this case here, the dependent variable is the number of snakes. Now the independent variable, similarly, is going to come from the other side. That's going to come from here. This is the x-axis. So independent variable comes from here. In this case, that's just the number of years that have gone by. And remember, if you can use it in the sentence depends on, I can say that the number of snakes depends on how many years have passed. So after more and more years pass, I can see that the number of snakes is rising. So that's an independent-dependent relationship, okay? So our target here is to try to figure out what's the initial value. Again, that's the number of snakes that we have at time 0, and what's the growth factor. So you might be inclined to just say, okay, initial value, that's at time 0. So let's look over here at time 0. We need to figure out what's the y value. Over here, it looks like it's 0, right? But it's actually not 0. It's just a really small number. The way that this graph is set up, I can't actually see that number. Likewise, I really can't even tell what this number is right here. The number is too close to this bottom line here. So we're going to take actually a step back, and we're going to start by trying to figure out how many snakes there were at year 2. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and you can also zoom your document in to see this yourself. So I can see over here that I have some labels. This line over here is 100. This line over here is 200 snakes. This line over here is 300 snakes. But I had these lines that are kind of in the middle as well. So to figure out what those lines mean, I just have to count and see how many there are. So I see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 sections between 0 and 100. So 100 divided by 4 tells me that each of these sections here has to be worth 25, right? So I know this is 25, 50, 75, 100. So if I follow this line over here, I can see that this point here has a y value of 25. So at 2 years, this graph tells me that I have 25 snakes. So I'm starting off over here. At 2 years, I have 25 snakes. Similarly, let's see this line right here for 3 years. So if I follow this line over here, I'm over here at 125, because remember, each of those lines are worth 25. So it's one line above 100. I can also see year 4 went a lot higher, and that's all the way at the top of the graph. If 600 is right here, that means that at the top, I have 625. Okay, so that's what I have so far based on what I can see from the graph. Now, the next thing that I can actually do is I can figure out right now what's that growth factor. So the way that I find the growth factor is I'm trying to see what number do I multiply from here to get to here, right? But it might be hard to figure that out at first, right? A very easy thing that you can do to find that is do the opposite. So instead of figuring out what do I multiply to get from here to here, what I can actually do is I can divide these two terms. So I can say 125 divided by the term right above it. So this term divided by that term. Use a calculator, you're gonna see that is equal to 5. 125 divided by 25 is 5. So that means this times 5 gives me 125. And I can check it again. 125 times 5 is going to give us 625. So if I wanted to fill the rest of this table out, all I have to do is go ahead and use that growth factor. So I'm going to do 625 times 5. I get 3,125. Again, I multiply that by 5. I got 15,625. One more time, 78,125. So I know my growth factor is 5, but I still have trouble in that I need to figure out what's my initial value. Remember, the initial value is going to end up being right here at time 0. So I know that when I'm moving down this table, I keep multiplying by 5, right? Times 5, times 5, times 5. Now, if I actually want to go in the opposite direction and move up the table, I just need to do the reverse of that. So instead of multiplying by 5, if I want to move up the table, I divide by 5, right? That's kind of like when you're looking at a linear relationship, you add moving down, you would subtract going up the table. And just to see if that works, right? Let's see, from 625, if I divide 625 by 5, I should get 125. So 625 divided by 5, 125. And again, this number divided by 5 gets me back to 25. So now 25 divided by 5 gives me 5. And finally, the last step, 5 divided by 5 gets me to 1. So we started off with 1 snake. After 7 years, we have 78,000 snakes. So just something to think about. How is this possible? How could you start off with just 1 snake that's released in an area somewhere, and then eventually you end up with that snake actually reproducing? Okay, what do you think you know about that snake you started off with? So we have our initial value now is 1. Now, this here is all the information that you would need to come up with an equation. We're not going to focus on the equation yet today. We'll get to that tomorrow on Friday. Okay, today all we're focusing on is finding these 2 things, your initial value and your growth factor. Okay, so if you have to rewind, replay this example, watch over it again, just see how I did it moving down the table, moving up the table, and you're going to practice the same exact thing on the next 2 pages, right? I also have some instructions typed at the top of the next page just to help that you do through that, right? First step, figure out your dependent variable. Figure out your independent variable. Try to figure out how are these horizontal lines marked. In this case, they're all marked, so it's not too big of a deal. Then you're going to use those lines to figure out what are the y values of the points. So you're figuring out what are these values here according to these lines. Then you're going to use those y values to figure out what your growth factor is. And again, I did that by dividing a term by the value above it. Then you're going to multiply to go in the opposite direction, to move down the table for all the rest of it. You're going to divide going upwards until you get to figuring out what your initial value is. So that's the goal. These basically two that are highlighted is the goal for today, to figure out what's the growth factor, to figure out the initial value, right? If you have any questions, anything at all doesn't make sense, please let me know in the Zoom session, all right? Good luck.